Patrick Qualiano and Milton Justice will begin spring term at the Actor Lab in New York City on April 13th. For more information, go to www.theactorlab.nyc or email info@theactorlab.nyc.
There are a lot of reflections that I've had. One of the things I wasn't able to record last week was the problem I was having with realizing that I could not find the nature of being lost as a character. I just couldn't find it. I couldn't find where to get it. It's like I knew how to build it intellectually, but I wasn't able to kind of escape into this person who was lost. I found it particularly interesting, and it was because I, the actor, if I may, could not find that connection. Now, what was interesting was that in working with JP on Tuesday, or whenever I worked with him this week on that scene, and I began to build it, who knows, in a way I would build it, because what I began to talk out was, in the monologue, they talk about the fact that he's herded cattle in Nebraska, and then in Montana, and then in Arizona, and then, if any of you know that monologue, and then now in Texas, and it's spring in Texas, and calves are born. All of that, and he said, at the end of it, he says, and I realize that I don't know what I want, and I'm lost. Okay, so that's what the monologue tells us. So what I found that I was building, and this was really interesting to me, I was building each of those places just as an exercise with him. And so I found myself being in Nebraska and building herding cattle and living through the experience of doing that. And yet it wasn't enough. It wasn't what I was looking for. And then I went to another thing, and then there was a different sort of thing, and I built that. And so what I realized was, in talking out all of this, I, Milton, began to understand the nature of being lost from my point of view. And I mean, it was really interesting. And again, when I woke up at 2:30 in the morning and stopped worrying about Nika and then got into everybody else's problems, I suddenly realized that I had figured out how I, based on this play, could experience being lost. And it was really weird, because what I was doing, something that I've always objected to, was sort of seeing myself in that circumstance. I mean, I was really able to finally, after a week, go to what it would be like to do that. So then when I woke up at 2:30 in the morning, and I thought, okay, now I understand what it means, but it's not the character. That was where I began to really understand, I think, a really complex part of this work, which is that I, the actor, have to personally understand what the play is about in an experiential way, and also understand what the play is about from a character's point of view. Vienna has a really cool audition. Two things came out loosely based on the family of Jesse Jackson. Vienna is one of those actors who has a tendency to overwhelm herself with the facts of the play. She sees the facts of the play and she goes, oh my God, it's the wife of a great man. Oh my God, there's no love in the relationship. Oh my God. And so she sort of went from one thing to the other as she began to do this overwhelming thing, which she sent to me in a text. And I could tell even from the text, the woman was panicking. Issue number one, you, the actor, in this case, Vienna, the actor, has to figure out what each issue she had means. What must it be like to be what must it be like to be the wife of a great political figure? What must it be like to be in a marriage where there's no love? That's one thing. But the other thing is that we came to is part of your talent as an actor is to figure out what to work on first. Vienna, first of all, has to figure out what is the most important thing for her to build. In fact, I even suggested to her the idea if let's act like you're doing a documentary on this woman. What would you ask her? And so she said, brilliant question. What did you see in this man? And she was smart because she knew that she didn't know enough to answer it. Boy, I got to tell you something. That's huge. That's huge, knowing what it takes to answer the question. Vienna knew she couldn't answer that question. What do I see in that man? And so we said, well, let's figure out what question you can answer. And oddly enough, the question that she came up with was, what was your life like when you grew up, or something like that? And then she grew up in poverty, and her mother was a maid, and all of that. And then all of a sudden she said, oh, wow, that gives me something to answer this bigger question. But look, I point this out because, acting is really difficult. It really is digging to find all of this information and being smart enough to figure out what all you need. The two things that I found interesting this week, one of them was that I, as an actor, have to understand the idea. I have to understand what the idea is about. I have to understand it. You cannot have a relationship to it that is removed. You can't have an intellectual, you cannot have a hypothetical relationship to it. You have really got to understand for you what that means. I'm thinking maybe you have to understand it for you before you get to what the character is. Then I can sit back and say, okay, now at least I understand maybe the size of the idea. At least maybe now I understand what the big deal is, why everybody's so upset, why this character is upset, because I understand in a kind of Perishvanier way, living through and feeling just like this whole sensation of what this character is going through before I figure out who she is. And I think that was the thing. First of all, I was so relieved because seriously, it was the first time that I really understood the concept of being lost as a person. In fact, I think I told you when I was talking to Mattior about it, Mattior said, yes, but what about when the Tennessee Williams play closed and you had a nervous breakdown in the middle of Central Park? And I said, yes, I had a nervous breakdown, but I wasn't lost. I mean, in other words, I didn't think about giving up my career. It was different. I mean, I experienced, probably for the first time in my life, complete and total failure based on having committed a year of my life to something that I assumed was going to be the beginning of my big and throbbing career. I wasn't lost. I didn't sit back and think I'd made the wrong career decision. I couldn't figure out what lost was. But this week, I was able, by talking out the experience of what Biff was going through that he talks about in that monologue, I was able to connect to what it must feel like to feel lost. Then the next step, now that I understand what it is, now I can move out of me into him. I think that's why Stella was after us to understand the size of ideas. I think she wanted us personally to understand the size of ideas so that we knew what our obligation was to come up to the size of the idea rather than pulling the idea down to us. I add that to your toolbox because I do think it's important. I've always talked about this, but now I understand it. I talk about it because I keep feeling like the exercises that are geared towards us understanding the size of ideas, we keep missing. If we're building what's behind the quote, art is power, we're missing the size of the idea of art. And even the exercise that we do, building a point of view of should actors marry, I think we miss the size of the idea of being an actor, and we miss the size of the idea of marriage.
Would you say there's a component in it of when you're asking the question, like, what is the nature of marriage versus what is the nature of being an actor, like recognizing whether you have a single or multiple ideas competing and like what the idea even is?
It's a different thing. The thematic idea of it, before I move into the point of view, I know why Stella gave us the Gibran essays, because they are all a big idea. But I know that's why she gave it to us. We have to come up to the size of the idea. We are not getting the size of the idea. And as a result, we are pulling all the plays, the exercises, the signs down to us. And I do think it is a matter of a real concerted effort on our part to come up to the size of the ideas. And then if I know what the idea is about, now I can look at my character's point of view about it. It helps my choices in feeding into the play. Until I personally understood what the nature of a person being lost was, there was no way I could play that. I guess it was like Viola Davis talking about when she did Fences on Broadway, and she could never understand why the woman was so obsessed with her husband's illegitimate child. And then by the time she did the movie, she'd had a child and she knew exactly. If we want to be a big actor, if we want to do this big work, we have to begin to understand, really just like in our soul, in our spine. If I'm playing an actor, I have to understand what it means to be an actor, not intellectually, not as an essay, but I have to really understand what is the nature of being an actor and understand that it is a big idea.
I was thinking like that could be why you give me the critiques on being like too academic or intellectual, is because I think I separate myself from it too much.
I think that happens all the time. I hear it in every tone. Every time actors start analyzing things, I can just hear it in this boring tone. I thought Nika was going to give me a heart attack the other night in class. He's got this dull voice when he talks about something, and when he starts talking about anything connected to acting, and it's like that, and you're thinking to yourself, my God, I'm going to fall asleep. I don't know. That's one of the things that happens to drive me insane. When actors talk about these huge ideas as if it's, I don't know, it's a boring test question. It's the reason I keep saying, stop answering the question. Stop answering the question. And I'm only interested in your connection to it.
If you have questions for Milton, you can email him at milton@theactorlab.nyc.